Welcome back to Module 5 of COM 3073. Today we're going to focus on research and ethics. You might be asking yourself, why would we be talking about ethics when it comes to research in the first place? Well, as you'll see in the video, a lot of things can go wrong in research if certain protocols are not in place. The main questions we're going to answer in today's module are, why do we even care about ethics in research? And what events in history brought us to the systematic methods we use in order to protect the rights of our participants? I've linked a few videos in the info section that provides a good account of modern-day problematic research projects and how they transformed how we conduct research in colleges and universities. So let's get into the content of ethics. For part 1 of our video, I wanted to begin with the roadmap and describe an entire history of problematic research. We begin by talking about experimentation on human subjects in Nazi Germany during World War II and the Holocaust. We then talk about the Nuremberg trials and the Nuremberg Code that resulted from these Nazi human experiments. We then turn our attention to several problematic modern-day research projects that happened as parts of colleges and universities. We focus specifically on the ethical and moral dilemmas in research projects and what additional protections we granted to research participants by consenting to be part of our research, the Belmont Report. Finally, we focus on what checks and balances we have in research by discussing institutional review boards and research protocols. I'll talk a little at the end about how deception is still used sparingly in research to protect the goals of the study. So let's travel back to the early 1940s in one of Nazi Germany's concentration camps. This section may cause you some stress, so if it does, please feel free to skip this part of the video. A series of medical experiments on adults and children were carried out on prisoners in concentration camps by scientists and researchers. At Auschwitz and other camps, select inmates were subject to various hazardous experiments designed to help Nazi Germany progress in making powerful biological weapons, aid in healing injured soldiers, and advance in ideological goals of racial cleansing. The most notorious of these experiments that happened in concentration camps were on twins, where dyes were injected in one twin's eyes to see if the color of the other twin's eyes would change. They conducted bone transplants from one human to another human without anesthesia. They conducted head injury experiments where they would subject children to constant head injury until it drove them insane. They dropped the temperature of inmates to see how long they could remain in a state of hypothermia before they finally succumbed to the cold. They also did poison research, research on dangerous immunizations, consumption of seawater research, and experiments with the goals of sterilizing millions of people quickly and easily. We can see from these extreme examples how profoundly immoral and unethical behaviors in research necessitated sweeping changes in how experiments involving human subjects were conducted. The Nuremberg trials, also known as the doctors' trials, were undertaken at the close of World War II. It was the first of 12 trials of German doctors for the heinous and egregious war crimes committed to the prisoners. The trials lasted for several months, and at the conclusion, most were given life sentences, 7 were committed to death, and yet another 7 were acquitted. 10 major points or guidelines of research were created following the Nuremberg trials. These 10 points of the Nuremberg Code serve as minimal criteria that must be met for human subjects research. The first was voluntary consent. This meant that participants must willingly agree to participate in the research project without any coercion on the part of the researcher. The second point was that research should only be conducted if the results cannot be obtained elsewhere, and knowledge from the results obtained must be for the good of society. The third point was that the researcher must recognize and acknowledge all possible risks associated with the research project. Point 4 is that the study should avoid any long-term physical or psychological harm and suffering to the participant. The fifth point is that if participation in the study can result in death or injury, the study should not be conducted. The sixth point acknowledges that although some studies may carry some risks to participants, the risks should never outweigh the benefits. The seventh point is that the researcher must have foresight in making sure that things are in place so a participant is not injured during the course of his or her participation. Point 8 is that only capable scientists and researchers should carry out research. The ninth point is that a participant should be allowed to withdraw from a study at any time without incurring any penalty from the researcher. And finally, the 10th point is that scientists must end or suspend a study that they believe might have led to injury or might lead to injury. If you look carefully at points 3 through 7, you can see some remarkable similarities in what they are professing. They all in some way talk about mitigating risks and preventing injuries to the research participants. This brings up the most important recognition from the Nuremberg trials and the Nazi Germany experiments, which carries through to all research conducted even today. It's the idea that among anything else, the researcher must do no harm. The tea room trade was a study conducted by Lord Humphreys in 1968 as part of his doctoral dissertation. The study documented anonymous male-male sexual behaviors undertaken in public bathrooms. Humphreys' main goal of his research was to debunk the stereotypes of participants in the tea room trade and demonstrate that people of diverse social backgrounds engaged in this activity. Humphreys misrepresented his identity to participants of the tea room trade, claiming that he would be the lookout for the two males who were engaged in the sexual activities. He would then write down these individuals' license plate numbers and track down their residences to see what kinds of social lives they lived. Humphreys would sometimes interact with participants at their home, never revealing the true intent of his study. The tea room trade has been criticized mainly on 3 bases. First, Humphreys didn't ever get consent from participants. He merely interacted with participants and entered them into his study without ever asking for their approval. Second, Humphreys violated participants' privacy by locating their identity through license plates and following them home to their residences. On a few occasions, he even went so far as to sometimes push his way into these individuals' homes with the threat of revealing the participants' behaviors to their families. Third, Humphreys deceived participants by hiding the intent of the interviews when he found participants at their home. You can probably see why the tea room trade study is taught as a principal example of unethical social scientific research. The Stanford prison experiment was conducted in the basement of the psychology department of Stanford University in 1971. The researcher, psychology professor Philip Zimbardo, led his group of graduate students to investigate the causes of difficulties between guards and prisoners using the backdrop of humans' potential to engage in sadistic behaviors. In what was planned as a 2-week experiment, half the participants were randomly assigned as prisoners, whereas the other half as guards. In a short period of time, the guards displayed sadistic and authoritarian behaviors, even subjecting the prisoners to psychological and physical torture. The project was abandoned 6 days into the experiment after several students dropped out of the study from severe mental fatigue, and ethical concerns about the study grew across the Stanford campus. I've provided links below of a trailer that documents the Stanford prison experiment to give you a Hollywood glimpse into what it might have been like to be part of this experiment. Viewer discretion is advised. You can probably already tell from this short clip that this is another case example of unethical social scientific research. But what principles of good research did it violate? The Stanford prison experiment has been criticized on a number of different bases. For one, the treatment of prisoners by the so-called guards led to psychological and sometimes even physical injury. In Zimbardo's report, he documented at least 1/3 of the guards engaging in what he called genuine sadistic tendencies. First, it's likely that with some careful consideration, Zimbardo could have forecasted significant risks with his research. Second, after reviewing tapes and records and interviewing participants, it was determined that Zimbardo's research inflicted psychological harm on participants. Finally, despite requests and even pleas from participants to leave the study, Zimbardo would convince them that their participation was necessary and not allow discontinuation. You can see why the second example is commonly taught as a case of unethical social scientific research. The obedience to authority figure study of Stanley Milgram was conducted on the campus of Yale University in 1961. The study sought to explain why some people during World War II mindlessly followed the orders of others to kill millions of people in a genocide. Milgram used deception to make participants believe that they were hurting another participant by giving them electric shocks at increasingly higher voltages. Despite several participants objecting to hurting the other person any further and wanting to discontinue their participation, the experimenter prodded, saying, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you continue," or "It is absolutely essential you continue," or even, "You have no choice, you must go on." The participants obeyed and continued on with the electric shocks in spite of their clear psychological distress. I'm going to show you a short clip that exposes the ethical dilemmas of the Milgram experiment. Milgram's study was a catalyst for sweeping reform in how human participants are treated in the research process and the ethical responsibilities of researchers. Milgram's experiment was problematic for a number of reasons. First, Milgram never had a hypothesis or even a research problem in mind. He merely wanted to see how far people would go in hurting someone else when they were told to do so. This goes against the principle of only executing research that is for the good of society. Second, like the Stanford experiment, Milgram's study led to extreme forms of psychological distress. Milgram's participants were observed trembling and sweating profusely during the course of the study, and by seeing these clear signs of distress, Milgram should have stopped it immediately. Third, despite some participants explicitly telling Milgram that they no longer wanted to go further with the study, he prodded them, telling them that they were required to continue. Here is yet another example of social scientific research that changed the ethical standards which still remain today. The Belmont Report was created by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, and it applies to both biomedical research and behavioral research. The report was issued in 1978 in response to the ethically problematic research discussed previously. 3 core principles emerged in the report: beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. The principle of beneficence means that the researcher must weigh the potential risks of the study with its costs and maximize the benefits of the research while doing everything in his or her power to minimize the risks. The idea of beneficence is consistent with the philosophy that the researcher should do no harm. The principle of respect for persons means that the researcher must recognize the autonomy and free will of participants and allow them to opt into their study using a process of informed consent. Finally, the principle of justice means that the benefits and costs should be administered fairly to all participants. In other words, each person should be treated equally. The three guiding principles of the Belmont Report are the bases for all decisions made by university institutional review boards. These boards determine whether any research project in the university meets the minimum criteria for protecting the rights of research participants and the integrity of the research process. The Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is comprised of a panel of compliance officers, researchers, and community members at each university. The board receives applications to conduct any research involving human subjects undertaken by members of that university. Because all studies are so vastly different, biomedical research is usually separated from social scientific research, and a standard set of guidelines is used to determine whether the study meets the guiding principles of beneficence, respect for persons, and justice. The IRB asks researchers to submit a proposal narrative documenting all the steps the researcher wants to employ in the research project. They also have to submit their consent forms, any experimental manipulations, and scales or measures they're using in a questionnaire. The IRB carefully looks through all of the documents and decides whether the study does or does not meet the standards of ethics. To the right is the Institutional Review Board homepage at the University of Texas at San Antonio for your reference. Informed consent acknowledges each potential research participant as an autonomous individual who can make his or her own choices about whether or not to participate in the research project, free from coercion. The consent form is the physical manifestation of informed consent. The form documents who the researcher is, explains the goals or objectives of the study, the possible risks, the benefits, and what is expected of the participant. Consent is given on the consent form with one signature. A disclosure form usually has everything on it that the consent form would have, but with the exception that it does not require a signature. Disclosure forms are normally used in research that carries very minimal risks to participants. Finally, an assent form is created if participants are minors under the age of 18. The minor would complete a consent form, but an assent form must also be completed by the child's legal guardian, giving the researcher permission to interact with the minor. To the right is an example of what page 1 might look like on a consent form. One last point about ethics in research is that deception is sometimes used by the researcher to maintain the integrity of the research topic. How is deception used? Sometimes the researcher will withhold the actual goals of the study. So instead of saying, this is a study attempting to link television use with loneliness, they might instead say something like, this is a media study. We'll talk a little bit later about why the researcher might want to conceal the goals of the study, but know that this exists. Additionally, some researchers will make you believe that you're interacting with another participant, but this participant is actually working for the researcher and is using a pre-written script to interact with you. We call these actors confederates. I had a graduate student working on a video game study once tell participants that they were going to play with another participant, but in actuality they were playing with a confederate. The most important thing that researchers must keep in mind when using deception is the possible effect it might have on the participant. When using deception, the researcher must debrief participants at the end of their participation. Debriefing simply means that the researcher shares with the participants the actual goals of the study and where he or she deceived the participant. That's all I have for Module 5, but please also remember to read the textbook pages listed in the syllabus. We started this video by discussing ethics in research. We covered things like the Nuremberg Code, the Belmont Report, and we viewed some unethical research projects that occurred in the modern era. We then talked about the importance of institutional review boards or IRBs in colleges and universities, and the idea of informed consent. I hope you found this video helpful. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions about this module, and also please don't forget about Module 5's quiz. I'll see you again for another video. Take care.